Hi, I'm Tamara, and this is TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Hi, everyone. Today I'm speaking with Derek Nybor. Derek is the president and CEO of the Forest Products Association of Canada. Today we are talking about sustainable forestry in Canada. It's a great conversation, a big, huge topic. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Hi, Derek. It's really good to see you.
Hi, Tamara. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I'm interested in this conversation because we pride ourselves on our forests in Canada. Here in BC, for sure we do. You're the president and CEO of the Forest Products Association of Canada. What does that mean?
That's right.
What do you do?
So we were, yeah. So we represent companies across the country on the wood manufacturing side, pulp and paper, biomaterials. So really the full suite of the forestry value chain, and we're basically the go-to between the industry and the federal government. And it's a two-way street. You know, there's a lot of things that industry wants the federal government to do to strengthen opportunities for our people and our communities. And when the federal government works on programs like carbon pricing and whatnot, they want to know. They use us as a window into the forest sector, if you will. So we're a little bit of a go between the industry and the federal government.
Okay. So, for the everyday average Canadian, if they hear that and they're like, okay, well, that doesn't really affect my life in any way, shape, or form, what Derek does for a living. But it kind of does, doesn't it? It affects all of us.
Well, it does in a big way. We're talking a lot about moving to a lower carbon or a net zero carbon economy by 2050 in Canada, and without forestry and without forest products, we won't get there. And I don't need to tell anybody from British Columbia about pest outbreaks and fires and droughts. So both on the forest management side, but also on the forest product side, we have solutions that can help us achieve that net zero carbon economy in the future.
How would you grade Canada's, forestry industry? How would you grade it? Like on, let's say a letter grade, right? A being the best. Are we, and being sustainable, like how are we doing?
Yeah, I think first of all, we're unique. We have almost 10% of the world's forests are here in Canada. That's pretty incredible. And maybe we can talk a bit about third-party certification or the audits and some of the checks and balances that go into making sure that work on the ground is being done the right way. We're almost 10% of the world's forests and almost 40% of the world's third-party independently certified forests. So that moves us into the A grade for sure. And I would say we would be in the same class of advanced countries like Sweden and Finland who have a lot of forests in their countries and are doing a lot with that natural resource to provide for communities in terms of economic opportunity, but also to drive good environmental outcomes as well.
So what do you mean by third party?
So on certification, so the first thing about Canada that's also really unique that a lot of people don't understand is most of our forestry is done on public land. 94% of forestry in Canada is done on land under the purview of provincial governments. We also have Indigenous communities and Indigenous governments that have an important voice in how we manage our land base. So what comes with having so much forest on public land is that community consultation, that obligation to the community in terms of getting input on how do we want to manage this forest. So before any single tree is harvested, millions of dollars are spent on planning, local science to look at all mammals, birds, and fish living in that forest. What are the Indigenous and non-Indigenous community values? What might a hunting group want? What might a snowmobile club want in terms of road construction? So we're really unique in Canada. You look at the U.S. U.S. is probably 80% private land. Finland and Sweden are probably about 50-50 in terms of private public, but we have a really heavy public land base in forestry in Canada, and that's unique to the rest of the world.
So when you hear people say, "Oh, that's on Crown land," is that what you mean by public?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Under the purview of provincial governments, but also, with important responsibilities to Indigenous governments and Indigenous communities in terms of their voice and their values.
Okay, so when you're talking about this, it makes me think of Fairy Creek in BC. So there's been a lot of, protests over the logging of old growth forests in BC, and it's very confusing for the average person, right? So somebody who doesn't really know much about forestry. I mean, I'm a perfect example. I'm not an expert on forestry. I hear about it in the news. I see big trees being cut down, and of course, it hurts my heart. I'm like, oh my gosh, like, why are we doing this? And then I see protests and people angry about it, and people have signs on their lawn all over in my neighborhood, to protect old growth forests. How I just like, where is it just seems like there's no clear answer ever on what we're doing. Is that part of forestry management, or are we selling things to the US, or you know what I mean? It's very confusing.
Yeah. It's a very complex issue, and I think the other, I think the maybe to be clear in terms of forestry in Canada, the old growth component that we see on the west coast, on Vancouver Island, the Fairy Creek area, that's about 1.5% of forestry in Canada. That's an important part of forestry, and those are important local community discussions and debates that we need to be having about what do we want to be doing with our land base, what values do we want to be recognizing and protecting. But most of the work that I work on with our members is across the boreal forest, more, beyond, which is where trees actually are going to succumb to pests or drought or fire or be blown over by wind when they turn 80 to 100 years old. So the majority of forestry in Canada is dealing with trees that don't live that long. And so the Fairy Creek issue is, I don't want to blow by the importance of that, and the importance of that community discussion. And you got a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different values. And I grew up in a forestry community in rural Eastern Ontario, and I say to my friends who in the cities who might not understand it, it's not too different from a residential rezoning building, or a new condo going up in your neighborhood. Different people will have different opinions on how high the building should be, how many levels of parking should it have, what should it be made with, how many entrances to the building, and that's similar to a forest management plan. You're going to have a lot of different people with different perspectives on and values, and what our registered professional foresters do is try to bring all of those values together to try to come up with the most balanced and fulsome forest management plan that's going to work. And you get competing values. I was talking with a group in Grand Prairie, Alberta, a few weeks ago, and they have a grizzly bear population challenge, and they've got a caribou population challenge, but both of those species want different things in terms of how the forest needs to be managed. So it's that inherent balance and a bit of a clashing of the values, if you will, and that's a big complexity in forestry.
Okay, so you mentioned pests, and because pests wouldn't just be bugs, right? Are animals pests too? Like, I never really thought about the pest factor.
Yeah, the pests are more like bugs, beetles, emerald ash borer. So these are insects basically that invade and destroy, and you're seeing that in BC, right? Like, the reason we've had a reduction in how many trees that can be harvested is because we lost a lot of trees to fire. And the reason the fire ripped through is because the mountain pine beetle damaged those trees and made them susceptible to burn easier, right? So when fire season happens, or a few lightning bolts come, or a campfire goes errant, it's like kindling, or it's like a tinderbox. And the amazing thing, you think about that pine beetle that started in BC, about 10 or so years ago, it's now ripped right across through into Saskatchewan. So and it speaks to the importance of tending to and managing our forests, right? And it's an important part. It's an important part of our foresters' jobs.
I guess it's kind of on a much larger scale. It's like having a garden in your backyard, and you tend to your garden, and you pull out the weeds, and you cut things back, and you do what you need to do to have a successful garden. And I guess a forest is no different, except you just said that, we have so much forestry in Canada. Like it's not like your backyard garden. It's a huge job. So it's this is so broad, Derek. You know what I mean? Like it's such a huge topic, what we're talking about, to sort of understand the importance of it and the sustainability of it. And climate change, it's all just sort of, coming in. But the average person, like again, why is a 2x4 so expensive? Why, when I go to the hardware store, a 2x4 is so expensive now? And the average person would think to themselves, okay, well, we have this huge forestry industry in Canada. Why am I paying so much for it? Does it affect Canadians?
It does in a big way. We saw it with toilet paper during the pandemic. Do you remember that when at the beginning, when there was a run on toilet paper and there was not a lot on the shelves? And I think if anything, the pandemic, well, I think the pandemic taught us a lot of things, but I think one is about the importance of self-sufficiency and trying to get the best out of our natural resources here in Canada. And we're blessed with an abundance of them, and managing them so they can stay with us for generations and forever, and so they can be resilient to climate change is critically important.
So in your position and with your experience and what worries you about moving forward? Like, what is your concern?
I'm worried about worsening pest and fire outbreaks and how more catastrophic the fires are. For every hectare of land that we harvest and replace in Canada. So that's the other rule is we replace more than we take. So it's about 2-to-1 in terms of for every tree harvested, you plant a couple seedlings to make sure that at least one of them is going to take. But for every hectare that we sustainably manage on, we're losing 25 times that to pests and fire. And that's a real problem for us in Canada. And it's not only the issue around forest health and the sustainability of the industry, it's also the safety of those communities. It's the safety of critical infrastructure. It's disproportionately Indigenous communities that are being evacuated due to fire. And it's air quality in places like Vancouver. You live there. You've seen the consequences when that smoke comes into Van, and so for a host of reasons, I would say that's the biggest concern. Now, this week, the federal government launched its national adaptation strategy to try to deal with these worsening natural disturbances, and I think more work in that space is absolutely important.
So, is it part of your responsibility to sort of, when we talk about policies, government policies surrounding, all the different, businesses and things that we need to take care of in our country to hopefully get to a place where we're not relying on everyone else for things like toilet paper. How does that work when you're helping to develop policy? Do you do that, or?
Yeah, we do, and we do very much based on science and where things are trending on the landscape, and it's in a few areas. It's not just in the forest. The forest is a big part of it because that's where it all begins, but it's also along our supply chains. One of the things in terms of our industry's decarbonization opportunity is how can we move more from trucks onto trains? In terms of lowering the GHG emissions along our value chains. At our mills, we've already done a lot of work. Canada's a leader in GHG reductions at our sawmills and our pulp mills. We've seen a reduction in GHG emissions of almost 70% since the 90s. So we've still got a bit of work to do there, but we're definitely not among the biggest polluters in the country. The other areas are products. You think of wood, and a lot of people don't realize wood stores carbon for generations. So we can basically lock that carbon into a wood product, move it into a building like UBC Brock Commons, and that stores carbon for generations, but it also displaces heavier fossil fuel intensive materials like cement and concrete and steel. Now, listen, those industries are doing work to try to lower their carbon footprint too, but we get the benefit of getting that tree out of the forest before it succumbs to fire, replanting that tree to restart that carbon storing cycle, and then move that carbon and lock it into the community. So there's a circularity piece here in terms of that carbon cycle that wood can play a really tremendous role, and that's going to help us lower GHG emissions and help fight climate change.
So, does the Canadian government, like, do they overregulate your industry, or do they underregulate companies? Like, how would you describe how our government works with the forestry business?
Yeah, I think the regulatory environment and the accountability that we have in Canada to governments and communities is what makes us stronger on the world stage. I think global customers want products from Canada because they know our human rights record. They know our commitment to sustainability and the regulations, for whether it's water or air or chemicals. It's a huge opportunity, and I think it's a competitive advantage for us. Most regulation is at the provincial level. I would say if industry had any wish in terms of how can government be better on issues like carbon, you'll get provincial perspectives or rules and regs. You'll get federal ones that kind of overlap or duplicate. That's where I think industry gets a bit frustrated if there's duplication or regulations that are redundant or create more paperwork. But I think overall, I think our strong regulatory environment sets us apart on the global stage, and that's a good thing.
Well, I think you could apply that to any industry, really, that there's redundancy.
Yeah.
And, healthcare is a perfect example of that, right? Where,
Yeah.
we're constantly, it does seem like sometimes there's extra work, extra paperwork, to put it lightly, when it comes to these sorts of things. What about the difference between, urban and rural challenges, right? Because, if you live in the city, you're not really seeing, the operations of the forestry industry because you're in the city. And so the rural areas, as you mentioned, a lot of Indigenous communities, they really are in the middle of it, if you will. They're the ones that see what's happening.
Yeah, it's a big issue. And I think it speaks to, some people use the term social license, other will say acceptance, other will say awareness. But I think one of the biggest challenges we face is the fact that a lot of people who did not grow up in a forestry community and a home where, my grandpa worked in forestry, my dad worked in forestry, is very part of much where I've come from. But I think a lot of people who are from more urban centers, and I think as we look at urban trends, urban centers getting bigger, new Canadians coming to our country. There is a growing, we don't have as many people in the city saying my grandpa and grandma used to work in forestry. So I think it's that awareness and education about what is happening in the forest, how are things being managed. Some of the things that we who live and work in the sector would consider forestry 101, but I think more of an outreach to urban families is absolutely needed. I also think there's a couple trends happening that are going to help that relatability, if you will. One is mass timber buildings like the 18-story UBC Brock Commons in Vancouver. I think when people see these wood structures going up, there's a 10-story wood building going up at George Brown College in downtown Toronto. What a great way to connect with urban people to see how these wood products from northern parts of the country are doing good things for the environment in the big cities. I also think a lot of talk around urban forestry and understanding that, our urban trees as well are vulnerable to pests and other outbreaks, and the tending to those urban forests is important. So, yeah, I think those points of relatability are important, but I also think it is probably the biggest challenge facing the sector, and that's bridging that urban-rural divide and trying to bring greater awareness to the work that we do and why it's important to people who live in big cities.
So wait, you didn't answer why a 2x4 is so expensive.
Oh, well, it's actually not. It's not at all right now.
Did it
If
come
you go
back
to,
down?
oh, they're way down. But you know what happened. But can
Yes,
I
of
share what
course.
happened there? Yeah. So it was fascinating. So I think like any other industry, I remember March 2020. I didn't know if we were going to have an organization anymore. I didn't know if employees at our mills were going to die en masse. Like it was just that awful feeling in around March 13th when we all kind of started to realize that something bad was happening. And I think there was a lot of uncertainty. And what happened with that was a lot of the wholesalers and the retailers immediately started canceling all their orders because they too were anticipating possibly no commercial activity. Our store is going to stay open. And I know at our mills then, we had some absenteeism because of sickness, and a lot of mills then shut down or temporarily curtailed operations because their customers are now saying, don't send me any more product. So then we get into April, May, and we start to see that this is very serious. We've got the long-term care crisis that we're facing in our communities. And then we start to see in our industry, now the retailers are calling us saying, we need more and we need it fast. And why? People are working from home. They've got a bit more time on their hands. I'm going to fix the deck. I'm going to fix the bathroom. I'm going to get the heck out of here because I don't want to be in an 18-story building. I'm going to move out to the country. So you had all of these social responses that then drove demand through the roof. And it happened in the US and it happened in Australia and it happened in Europe. So we got into a game of catch up and the demand for the product drove prices up. But I guarantee you, if you go to Home Depot this afternoon, you'll be a happy customer.
It's all come down. But isn't
It's all
I
come
mean, the
down.
reality of it is that's what's important to your everyday average person, right? It's like how can this, this is going up or this is going up. We talk about it all the time. It's in the news all the time, but it's funny that, a 2x4 does come up because it's like, wow, it's so expensive now. So thank you for answering
it's
that.
like a commodity. Yeah, it's a commodity product, and like I said, that was a surge unlike anything we could have ever imagined, and it's pretty amazing though. And I'll give a lot of credit to our truck drivers and our railroaders and the people along the supply chain who, as we were all dealing with COVID and the health impacts and the sickness that was happening, they kept things moving. It's pretty remarkable, actually, especially in a big country like Canada that in the winter and is dealing with floods, and in the summer is dealing with fires and still trying to move that product.
Yeah. It's fascinating. I've really never done a deep dive into how forestry works and what the concerns are. So I appreciate this perspective. I really do. And there's so many things. It seems like there is a lot to worry about, right? The pests you talked about, like that. You're right. We see it here. We can see the trees. Even in our city park, Stanley Park is having challenges with, so these urban trees that you talk about are also getting hit by these pests. So I can only imagine what it looks like out in our areas where it's just forestry for forever. As far as
Well, even go to Jasper Provincial Park was ravaged by the pine beetle. We're in a situation now, and this is all anybody who's denying climate change only needs to look at our national parks. Our national parks are now carbon sources. They are carbon sources. Those are protected areas. And this is one of the challenges. I think it instinctively, and conservation is critical, and that's inherent to how we do forestry in Canada. But we have to understand, in a changing climate, calling something a park or a protected area doesn't protect it from the realities of climate change. And that's why even Jasper Park, one of our companies was called in to do some thinning and get some of the trees out and some of the dead trees out to mitigate the risk of worsening fires. So it does make the case. And when I say this, I'm always very careful when I say this, because we're not looking to mow down every tree. You know what I mean? Like we're in the boreal forest, about half of that forest is not even managed at all and not touched. And the remaining part of the boreal, half of that is under some kind of a conservation measure. So forestry it's for me, it's not about forestry versus conservation. Forestry is about conservation, and I think in a changing climate, that management is even more critical to mitigate these risks related to climate that we've talked about.
So when we're, I feel like we're seeing more forest fires than ever before. You turn on the news anytime. I mean, look at California. It's constant and devastating. And in Europe in the summer when it's, hot, and it, are we seeing so much, like, is it, a so-called perfect storm where it's, the pests are a problem, the climate is changing, and then we have this trouble. How on earth could we possibly manage? There's so much forest. How could we possibly manage it so that we protect it?
Yeah, I think. Listen, I think a mix of absolute protected areas are important. We've got about 11% of the land base in Canada is absolutely protected, and I think there's definitely opportunity to do more there in parts in the north. But I think the biggest thing is debunking this sense that we protecting something or leaving it alone is going to make it okay. But the other side of that is not cutting everything down. The importance of forest management, and it's more important than ever in a changing climate to be doing that thinning, to be doing that management, and of course driving economic opportunity. These are important jobs. This is an industry. This is about $80 billion a year to the Canadian economy. That's critical to I think of communities like Prince George and Quesnel. Like this industry is helping power those communities. It's feeding our provincial tax base. It's supporting our communities. So there's definitely the economic piece, but I think the actual environmental benefits of managing, and then the carbon storing benefits of moving that wood into the city. And what we've not talked about is how do you use all that leftover, what would otherwise be wood waste, like chips and bark and sawdust from the sawmills, to turn that into something valuable, preferably something that's going to displace a more fossil fuel intensive material in your home or in the community, like a bioadhesive or a biofuel or some other kind of bioproduct. So really a full value chain opportunity in our sector, which is why we're pretty excited about it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, so before we I ask you any more questions, I just wanted to mention that we always like to thank our guests for being here, and we like to give back. And so we ask our guests to choose a Canadian charity, registered charity. You chose Ronald McDonald House Charities of Canada. I think everyone's familiar with their work. They do incredible work. And we will be giving them $500 in your name for your time that you spent with us. So I really appreciate that, Derek. Thank you for choosing Ronald.
Well, that means a lot to me. It's an incredible charity. And Ronald McDonald House is there for families when they're basically at their darkest time. And I can't say enough about that charity does across the country. Yeah. So thank you for that.
And thank you for choosing them. So how is the forestry industry approaching reconciliation?
Yeah, so it's today across the boreal forest, about 10% of the wood supply is now directly managed and controlled by Indigenous communities. That's a significant increase over the past 10 years, and we need to do more of it. So that's a step in the right direction. You think about where forestry happens, and it is on and or adjacent to Indigenous land, and it's all Indigenous land. But in terms of where active Indigenous communities are living, it creates an opportunity not only to respect and tap into those values and the needs of those communities, but also to provide economic opportunity. So we've not only seen a big shift in terms of direct management of the land, but we're seeing a lot of co-management with Indigenous communities and businesses. We're seeing a lot of First Nations communities running a log yard or running the tree planting program, or Indigenous contractors. We've got about 1,400 Indigenous-owned forestry businesses now working across Canada. So there's very strong links. The other exciting thing is the cohort of Indigenous youth that are coming up. It is the largest growing segment of the youth population in the country, or in Indigenous youth. So that's also a really, not only opportunity for them to participate directly and get involved in forestry businesses directly, but for those who want to work near their communities and work at a mill or work in a forest contracting business, that's a massive talent pipeline that's going to help power the future of our industry in Canada. So very, very close links between the forest sector and Indigenous communities. And what I'd also say is I observe the work across the country. Like any other community, no two Indigenous communities are the same. And the work to drive reconciliation is guided by what does that community value? Because not every community is going to want to plant trees. Not every community is going to want to run a sawmill. Not every community might even want to have anything to do with it. But I think those decisions and those conversations need to be happening at the community level. And it is complicated because you could have a forestry business that's operating in an area where you've got overlapping Indigenous lands, and you've got dozens of Indigenous communities who maybe want different things. So it's a lot of work, but it's important work, and I'd say it's trending in the right direction, but more needs to be done.
What are you excited about?
I'm excited about the innovation I'm seeing in wood building design, and the ability to build bigger, better, stronger with mass timber. And building codes are evolving, which means we can build in ways that are going to make, wood buildings fire resistant and safe. To meet seismic requirements, which are important, across Canada, but especially on the West Coast. So we've seen a lot of innovation in the architectural engineering design space, which I think is, and wood is beautiful. I was looking, I think it's the library in Calgary that is absolutely stunningly made of wood. And you get all of these biophilic benefits, of course, of being in a wood building too, in terms of that connection to nature. So I'm excited about that in terms of the innovation that's happening. And I'm also excited about the innovation around turning wood, what would otherwise be wood waste, into new products. The biofuel sector, the bioadhesives sector, a lot of potential to turn waste into something valuable. And I think if you're, talking to anybody in the forestry business, they'd always say, we want to get value from every part of that tree. We don't want waste. We want that circularity and that full value benefit realized. So so those would be my top two favorites. In addition to, as I said, the Indigenous work, the reconciliation work that's being done, that is critical. It's critical to respecting and honoring the values of those communities and what they want to see. But it's also an opportunity to drive some greater economic opportunity for all communities.
Geez, I feel like we could go on and on and on. I have way more questions because it's a big topic, Derek. It really truly is. And I think forestry in this country, especially in this province, it brings a lot of personal emotion too, right? Because we love our trees and we appreciate our trees, and it hurts us when we see that it's been cut down. I live in a house made from wood though, and it provides me shelter, and so there's so many things that come with the forestry industry and the average person doesn't even know what someone like you does, that there's even someone like you that exists, right? That is out there and representing different companies and all these different. So I really appreciate you taking the time to explain it. But I know that there's so much more that we could talk about. So I really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, Tamara, and thank you for having me.
Okay, so you can find Derek online at fpac.ca or on Twitter at Derek, that's Derek Nibor, Nighbor. Derek Nibor on Twitter. Thank you so much, Derek.
Thanks, Tamara. And if I can add, we have a great website with a lot of 101 information if anybody wants to check it out, forestryforthefuture.ca. Another, just for anybody who's looking to understand a bit more about what's going on in our forest, can find more information there.
Good call. All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Be sure to subscribe so you can join us every Tuesday for another conversation. You can also check out our website, telus.com/podcast, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at TELUS Talks.